Good evening. 62 years ago in Addis Ababa, 32 African nations came together to establish the Organization of African Unity, known today as the AU. The original gathering was hosted by none other than one of the original Pan-Africanists, His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I, also known as Ras Tafari Makonnen, the man whose name and personality became the inspiration for Rastafarianism and reggae music. I'd like to suggest that, as well as the 32 states represented in Addis Ababa in May 1963, there was a 33rd delegate who needed neither invitation nor introduction. That delegate was within and without, above and below, in front and behind. That delegate was in the very air that filled the conference hall. That delegate was none other than the music of Africa. In fact, at that historic conference, later that day, the music of Africa walked into the hall deftly and immaculately. This was none other than the inimitable, the indomitable Miriam Makeba, who was at her prime at that time. She had been invited by Emperor Haile Selassie to perform for the delegates. For more than an hour, the heads of state in attendance were under the spell of her powerful voice as she sang the click song, Ipindlela, Tula Tula, Nchilo Nchilo, Umqokozo, Amampondo, Dubula, Jigele Maweni, and Intoyam, among many others. By now, I hope you will see why I have decided to speak very briefly on the topic of the music of Africa as a source of resilience. In my recently published memoir, Faces and Phases of Resilience, I include music in the list of sources of resilience among the people of Africa, wherever they may be in the world, on the mainland, in the Caribbean, in the Americas, and in Europe, and everywhere else in the diaspora. In my book, I venture to suggest that resilience may be the ultimate distinguisher of humanity and Africanity. I am talking here of resilience, not bravado. I speak of resilience, not a false sense of martyrdom. I speak of resilience, not the Freudian death wish concept. My proposal is that wherever and whenever we encounter authentic forms of resilience, there is music not too far away. Even the kind of music which W.E.B. Du Bois called the music of the souls of black folk. Consider what Nelson Mandela says about music. The curious beauty of African music is that it uplifts even as it tells a sad tale. You may be poor, you may have only a ramshackle house, you may have lost your job, but that song gives you hope. African music is often about the aspirations of the African people, and it can ignite the political resolve of those who might otherwise be indifferent. One merely has to witness the infectious singing at African rallies. Politics can be strengthened by music, but music has a potency that defies politics, end of quote. Other sources of resilience include, among others, the environment, humor, the arts of lament. But because of music's ability to integrate, to interpret, to evoke, to provoke, to console, to cajole, and to agitate all at once, the music of Africa is the ultimate source of the resilience behind the resilience beneath the resilience we feel and see all around us. In other words, I'm talking about the reality behind the abstract word of resilience. James Baldwin once described artists, and I quote, as the only people who know the truth about us. He argued that soldiers, politicians, priests, union leaders do not know the truth about human beings. In the same vein, I would like to suggest that perhaps even the artists do not quite know the truth about us any more than they know the truth about themselves. They do not know the truth about us like music knows us. The music of Africa certainly knows the truth about us more than we realize. That is how and why it is the greatest source of resilience. Towards conclusion, let me recall the fable that Archbishop Desmond Tutu used to like to tell. When the white arrived in Africa, the white men had the Bible and the Africans had the land. The white man said, "Let us close our eyes and pray." At the end of the prayer, the white man had the land and the Africans had the Bible. I can still hear the Archbishop's naughty chuckle before he started his explanation of this favorite fable of his. But the contestations of the 18th and 19th century in Africa were not just about land, they were also about music, the music of Africa and the dances that went with it. Music was especially targeted because music was immediately recognized as a tremendous source, not only of joy, but also of resilience. African colonial subjects dug deep into the music of Africa as they toiled in the rubber fields of King Leopold of the Belgian Congo. African slaves sang in the 28 slave castles along the coast of West Africa. And they sang in the plantations once they arrived in the Americas and the Caribbean, bringing their rhythms and songs with them. And so if you ask me, who was Ntikana and what was his great hymn about? I'll speak to you about the use of music as a source of resilience and a form of resistance. If you ask me about John Knox Bokwe, Tio Soga, and Enoch Sontonga, I will speak to you about the three musical composers whose musical compositions, such as A Plea for Africa, Lizalise Idingalako, Nkosi Sikeleli Africa, nourished the resilience of South Africans throughout the 19th century and beyond. If you talk to me about Joshua Pudumo Mohapelwa, Ruben Tolakele Kaluza, Daniel Cornel Marivati, and Shalati Joseph Koza, I will tell you about musical composers who dug deep into the well of the music of Africa to inspire and sustain us during one of the most difficult periods in this country. Every time I hear the soaring voices of Salif Keita, Angelique Kidjo, Baba Mal, Assa, Yemi Alade, and Yusundo, I realize that the African griot and the traditions that created that griot are alive and kicking. The signature guitar of Luambo Makiadi of the Congo, also known as Franco, the mbiras and the yodeling voice of Thomas Mapfumo of Zimbabwe awakens me from all my dreams and all my daydreams. When Bob Marley encountered the fiery speech of one of the original Pan-Africanists, Marcus Garvey, which he made in 1937, that is the speech. Bob Marley used that speech to compose the song, Redemption Song. In fact, Emancipate Yourself from Mental Slavery are directly taken from that speech of Marcus Garvey. On the 4th of October 1963, 5 months after the founding of OAU, Haile Selassie I gave a speech at the United Nations General Assembly. One of Bob Marley's most radical and most popular songs, released in 1976, titled War, was based on that speech of Haile Selassie, and it went something like this. Until the philosophy which hold one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war. Me say war. Until there are no longer first-class and second-class citizens of any nation, until the color of man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes, me say war. Oops, I didn't want to talk about war. Bob Marley made me do it. All I wanted to do was to talk about justice and the music of Africa as a source of resilience. All I wanted to do was to excite you about the great musical experience you are about to have. I wanted to talk about Ohlange Choir, which popularized Nkosi Sikelel' Africa. I wanted to talk about Solomon Linda and Mbube. I wanted to talk about Strike Vilakazi and his song Meadowlands. But now, let me talk about Dr. Musa Nkuna, the Johannesburg Philharmonic Orchestra, and the great lineup of some of the best choirs and soloists in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are anything like me, you can't wait. Thank you very much.